the TEFL Commute, Season 10, Episode 1, Green, in which we touch on issues relating to the environment, from how to get a greener classroom to how to make that environmental lesson of yours sparkle. Let's get started.
Hi, Lindsay. Are you ready to sparkle?
I am ready to sparkle. I'm all sparkling for our debut episode of Season 10. How are you?
I love the reticent season.
I know it's been 10 seasons.
I know, 10
seasons. 10. Welcome, everybody. By the way, if you're listening, this is the TEFL Commute. We're a podcast. My name is Lindsay, and my co-host,
hi, I'm Sean,
who interrupts, is Sean. And this is a podcast for language teachers. Our tagline is the podcast is for language teachers. It's not about language teaching, but the topic often comes up. And
that's not the tagline. It's an approximation of the tagline, but you're close enough.
Yes. But it is close enough. I always get it wrong.
10 seasons.
10 seasons, and it's a back-to-school season right now for us. Sean, did you have a nice summer?
I did. I had a good summer. Work, bit of holiday, whatever. My advice from the summer is don't camp in 50 miles an hour wind, but apart from that, good. What about you?
My summer was nice. I was back in Canada visiting family. Haven't been there for quite some time, so It was always nice to get back. And yes, and I'm going back into teaching, but online teaching. Nothing much else to report about the summer there.
Oh, right. Oh, okay. Yeah, same here. I mean, it's still a couple of weeks before university goes back, but online is kicking itself into gear. So, but of course, the most important thing about it, September, is we record the new season. So
that's right. And each episode of our seasons here on the TEFL Commute is based on a topic. And this episode, the topic is green, as in environmental green, not Kermit the Frog green. But we're all about the environment on this episode, partly because we've been wanting to do an episode on the environment or on green issues for a while, and because a couple of things happened, one outside of ELT and one inside ELT, that kind of sparked this for us at the beginning of the summer. The first thing was something that happened outside of ELT. In June, The Guardian and several other newspapers, media outlets, that is, decided to retire a couple of terms from and change the terms they use to talk about what's going on the planet. They said that the terms that they weren't going to use anymore were too neutral, worn out, and too nice sounding to describe the crisis facing the planet. Sean, what terms do you think they meant?
Well, one has to be global warming.
That's correct. That's one that they decide is too nice sounding.
Not a surprise. I think wasn't it during the summer or just before the summer when a certain president misunderstood global warming to mean hot weather. I mean,
yes. And the other one?
It's too neutral. So probably climate change.
That's right. Climate change and global warming were considered too neutral, worn out, and too nice sounding to describe the crisis. This was The Guardian publicly announcing it would drop climate change for the terms climate emergency, climate crisis, or climate breakdown. And other publications did the same. Spanish news agency EFE said it would use the word crisis climática. Noticias Telemundo, the Spanish language news provider in the United States, announced it would start using climate emergency. And all of a sudden these terms started like popping up all over the place. So that, as a language teacher, that was kind of an interesting language thing happening.
Oh yeah, there's quite a lot of language evolving from that, isn't it? Maybe we'll touch upon it another time. I mean, I saw the phrase climate refugee for the first time over the
The Guardian also said it would start using wildlife instead of biodiversity, so not making it such a neutral term, and climate science denier instead of climate skeptic, which I think is also a kind of an about time thing. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think when we look back on this year, when you review a year in terms of language or whatever, what's happened, I think the terminology around language is probably one of the main things that's come out of the year, isn't it? I say that as a Brit, where obviously the word of the year will be pirogue, but
Yes.
I mean, on the other hand, you've got like the group like Evolution Revolution, which has become part of our everyday kind of talk now. So it's a podcast about language teaching. I mean, this is an area of language which is evolving as language does. So from a language point of view, it's interesting. It's a shame that we're having a climate crisis and that's what's happening as a result. But from a language point of view, it's interesting. Anyway, where should we go? Should we continue with the language, or should we?
Well, there was another thing that happened because it was more inside our wheelhouse, the ELT wheelhouse. It is our profession. I think in May or June or slightly before May, a new group kind of sprung up on social media and started getting quite a lot of attention. That was all about the climate crisis. They were all kind of declaring a climate emergency in ELT, and I don't know. Is it a group, a community, a movement, an initiative? What do you think?
Well, I think it's probably best left to them to describe. What do you think?
I think you're right. And exactly that, because our first episode of season 10, we're doing an interview episode, and we've invited two people from this group, which is called ELT Footprint, or from this, whatever we're going to call it, ELT Footprint, to come and talk to us about this. We're going to be joined very shortly by two admins of the Facebook group ELT Footprint. One of them is familiar to listeners of this podcast. It's our very own Ceri Jones, who is coming on as a guest and not a host in this episode. And the other one is another colleague and dear friend of ours, Kath Bilsborough. So let's get to our interview with ELT Footprint. Okay, so for the main part of this podcast, we're joined by two guests, and to introduce them, I thought I would read a quote that I picked up on their website. I'm going to read you the last part of the quote, and then I'm going to introduce our guests and ask them to tell us about the group and what this quote means. So here it is. Here comes the quote. Ready, Sean?
Yeah, got him.
All right. It's not everyone's job to save every part of the world, but it is everyone's responsibility to thank every person who is doing their part to save the world. Don't critique, just appreciate. Don't judge, just educate. We're all trying our best. Thank you. So that quote I found on the page of the ELT Footprint group, which is a group that recently started and is making quite a footprint. I don't know. Is that? Oh, yeah, there it is.
That's terrible. You couldn't do better than that.
But I'm very happy to say we have two people who are who were there with the group from the beginning, with us in our virtual studio. Ceri Jones, who everyone knows from the TEFL Commute, a regular host. Hi, Ceri.
Hi, how you doing?
Does it feel different to be a guest rather than a host, Ceri?
It does. I don't know if I'm going to be a good guest.
And Kath Bilsborough, who is another person from the beginning of the ELT Footprint group and longtime colleague and friend of ours, ELT writer, coursebook writer, teacher trainer, teacher, another Welsh person, two Welsh people. Hi, Kath.
Hello. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be on the TEFL podcast. New experience for me, and I'm quite excited about it. I don't get out much.
Excellent. Because it is a new experience, we'll forgive that it's the TEFL Commute podcast, but we'll forgive that.
A long-time listener there, obviously, yeah.
Sorry.
Anyway, Kath and Ceri, we invited you here for our episode, which we gave the title Green to this episode, because of the ELT Footprint. Now, you're both admins of the Facebook page, but can you tell us about ELT Footprint in general and how it connected to that quote that I found, and how new is this? Just a general introduction. What is ELT Footprint?
Okay, can I kick off, because I've just got the quote in front of me, in fact, and I just want to give it a little bit more context. So the quote was shared by someone called Carla Borthwick and inspired by a book called Earth is Hiring by Peter Kelly. And that was a quote that Dan Barber shared, when he did a plenary at the Innovate conference back in May. And during that plenary, he declared a climate emergency for ELT. And that was definitely a catalyst to bringing the group together. But it isn't just one thing. It was just that there were lots of conversations going on all at the same time, and this was being shared by so many people, and it kind of struck a chord with so many people that it just seemed the obvious thing to do was to try and create a space somewhere where we could bring these conversations together, because there seemed to be so many conversations going on, especially on Facebook, but on Twitter too. And so the logical thing seemed to be to create a Facebook group in the end after, I don't know, do you remember, Kath? It took us about a week, didn't it, to decide the shape and the how and the where, and then that's what emerged eventually.
Yeah, and I think it's still kind of being shaped, and we're still kind of finding our way around and growing and diverging and moving into other places, like, the blog, etc. So it's kind of a big experiment, really, but while it's happening, it's just growing and growing, and it's amazing, really.
It seemed to be very quick. It's kind of, if I remember at the beginning, because being a Facebook person, you went from, like, Daniel's, I think the conference, people were talking about the conference, and then all of a sudden the group was there, and then it just seemed to take off really quick. Did you find that from your point of view? It was just like whoosh, and I think there are 1,600 people in the group now, and that's only a few months down the road. That's quite big for a Facebook group, isn't it?
It is big. I mean, it was quite surprising, wasn't it, Kath?
Yeah, and it's nearly 17. It's gone up by another 100 almost. So by the end of this podcast, who knows? We might have reached another. But I think that's on the one hand, it's very exciting when that happens, and it's wonderful, and we get excited and we go on the chat and we say, "Have you seen the numbers?" But on the other hand, when you think about it, we shouldn't be surprised, because there didn't seem to be anywhere else where we could all get together to talk about these things. So, it's exciting.
So would we describe, I mean, the ELT footprint is, I was kind of trying to think of, like, what would I call it? Do you think it's a nascent movement, or is it like an initiative, a hashtag? Is it a group, or is it much looser? Is it just sort of an awareness place? What would you say?
I've used the term, maybe it's all of those things, and maybe it's whatever it needs to be to each person. It's very fluid, but I refer to it as a community.
Yeah, me too.
Okay.
Which is quite a nice C word. Yeah.
I think it's like we started off calling it a space as well, didn't we? Or a hub, somewhere where you can just come together and collect things in one place. But also that what happened was, because we all know what Facebook's like, it's not actually very easy to collect things. There's a lot of buzz going on, and you see the conversations that are ongoing. So it kind of grew into needing something on the side, as it were. And
yes.
So that's how the blog came about, which is more of a repository, really, than a blog. It's kind of where we try to make a little bit of sense and shape of all of these conversations. There's so much, because people want to discuss so many different things, so many divergent topics. So there is an overspill into the blog, which is kind of a quieter space where everything's a little more static.
I like community and space. I was kind of thinking the funny kind of things, like, is it like when you said a repository where you can put a whole bunch of things, I was like, a bin, like a recycling bin. And you can rummage around in there, like the blog, you rummage around and find something useful in there. But well, let's, before we talk more about what is actually being created there, because this is about, like, kind of creating things. I've seen there's lots of stuff. There's let's go back to kind of general things about, like, the climate emergency, and of course,
can I just pick up on that?
ELT, and go for it.
It was what Ceri said at the beginning. She was described as there's a climate. Daniel, when you were talking about Daniel, he said climate emergency in ELT. Yeah, I think was the word the phrase you used. What do you mean by that? Because I'm not sure. Is that ELT is causing a climate emergency? I mean, to somebody that hasn't seen the group or understand that.
I can't.
What does that actually mean?
Definitely can't put words in Dan's mouth or speak for
Obviously,
Dan.
yeah.
And I haven't actually sat down with them and found out what the story was of that declaration, I have to admit. But I think the thing is that it's rather than that the emergency is in LT, it's that's our sphere of action, that's our sphere of influence.
Okay.
There's quite a neat little video that I'm going to share the link with you that was shared on the group, and it's by a climate change academic called Will Grant, and he kind of breaks down action in the sphere of climate change into 4 levels, and one is individual, so it's just what you do on an individual basis within your life, and then the second was kind of you and the sphere of your friends and family, so kind of on a personal level and the people that you might influence on that level, and then the third stage is kind of like that word community, but you think about who do you interact with professionally, who do you have conversations with, who knows your name, and how can you use that also to influence and raise awareness and engage people in action. And I think it's more to do with that. It's what can we do as an ELT community, which is a huge community. And so if I was looking just now on the blog, and we actually have visitors from 76 different countries. Okay, they haven't all visited loads, but there are some countries that are more active than others, but there's this massive global reach. So actually there's a lot that we can do at what he calls the third stage of action, which is working together within a professional community. We can help each other with initiatives, we can suggest initiatives, we can inspire through example, and a lot of this is basically happening through the group, and I think it's reaching a lot more people than simply the 1700, but but we're much bigger than 1700, aren't we? So there's this idea that it isn't that the emergency is in ELT, it's just that we can act within our ELT sphere.
So it's like this is we as a community are responding to the global emergency, exactly, rather than saying, okay, I got it.
Then his fourth stage would be a stage where a lot of us are trying to do something anyway, but not through the ELT community. So which would be protests, petitions, writing to members of parliament, putting pressure on the political, sort of the macro stage, which is where we probably feel more helpless anyway. So that there's this idea that by engaging with the community, you can, what would be the word, amplify your actions. So there's that thing about what we do as a person, then what we do with our immediate community, and then this reaching out towards a profession, which then makes it a much wider sphere of influence.
Okay, so then, I mean, how good or bad is ELT with regards to climate change awareness and action? Is it something? I mean, I think everybody's aware of it this year. It's one of those topics. But I mean, how would you rate ELT in terms of climate change awareness and action? Good, bad, indifferent?
Shall I jump in there? It's a good question, really, and it's funny because when we were preparing for this podcast and thinking about it, Ceri went away and made some notes, and I went away and made some notes, and we both independently wrote something like, how long is a piece of string?
Yeah.
I mean, this idea. So in terms of our profession or our industry, whatever, however you want to call it, I think that it's the same as every other industry, and that in some places, we're not, we're not too bad, and then in other places we're just terrible. So if we look at, when I look at myself as an example, and Lindsay, you're the same here, and Ceri too, very often in our jobs as being an author. They might invite us to travel to the other side of the world to speak for 1 hour at a conference, on something. And I mean, this is terrible because, I mean, our carbon footprint is that's just ridiculous. So, but on the other hand, there are people who just don't, they work as an English teacher in their school, and they might not travel anywhere as part of their job, and they might be really careful about, the photocopies that they make, etc. So we're all over the place, and I think one of the key things for me, and what I've learned, is that we're not here to shame each other. We're here to support each other and to think very carefully about how we can do things better as an industry. So this whole thing about, if you're going to travel to the other side of the world, I'm not saying don't ever do it, but if you do it, try to make better use of your time when you get there and not just spend 1 hour giving a talk, etc. So I think that it very much depends on the context and the part of the world that you're in. And as we know, it's not one size fits all, and there are huge differences in people's situations depending on, I mean, James is in Brazil, and it's very different in Brazil to where I am in Spain. So, and then breaking it down into different areas. Are you a primary school teacher, or are you a university lecturer? And there are differences there as well. So we're all over the place is the the quick answer to that one, I think.
Is there a worry though when you say that we're not about shaming? Doesn't it always end up like any kind of movement for raising awareness about change? Unfortunately, online often does come along. There is often the shaming that then or not necessarily by you, or by other people, sort of the instinct to, and perhaps it was that with our question as well, the instinct to find who's responsible and let's shame them to not doing that.
Yeah,
so how
I was going to say that it's one of those things. It's it's not a league table, and you're not maybe involved in fracking, which might be considered one of the big enemies, but that doesn't mean that you can just sit back and not worry.
Exactly.
It's that. Yeah. So we're not into league tables of who's the worst enemy. We're not.
So you're not. There's no kind of.
Yeah, the quote that you quoted at the beginning. It's that thing about thanking anybody who's taking any action, rather than. Because you can't do everything. That's the whole point. If you read the whole quote, it's all about this. Well, sort of.
Yes, no, it's a great quote. Yeah, which I direct everyone to read at the ELT Footprint site on the Your About page. You don't then envisage the kind of thing. The last time we've had. I don't know, there have been other ones since, but another one that was recently in ELT, and I don't want to get into this, but was sort of representation at conferences on panels and stuff like that. And so there have been various initiatives to give awards to conferences that meet sort of an equality or gender equality in the plenary speakers or an equality of speakers and stuff like that. So, but you don't envisage, or there hasn't been kind of envisaging of doing that for ELT conferences or schools or things like that, are there? Or is there something I've missed?
There have been suggestions and discussions, but we've shied away from it, and we've gone back to that quote, and we've said we're not about giving awards. We're not about.
Okay.
That's not the ethos, and I think, Kath, would you agree with this? That one of our jobs as moderators that can sometimes be a little bit difficult, a little bit awkward, is when we do see that a conversation is verging towards that. And so we feel like we need to step in and make sure that no one feels that they're being, that they feel embarrassed about something that they've said or done. I don't know. Would you say, Kath, that was one of the challenges?
Yeah, I think that's one of the more difficult aspects of being an administrator, because how this usually goes, you can probably imagine, but how this usually goes is that one of us sees a comment on on Facebook, a post or a comment in response to somebody else's post, and we think it's a little bit dodgy for some reason. and then we send a private chat message saying something like, "Oh my God, have you seen what X has just written?" Or WTF, or but and then we usually, what I'm trying to say is we discuss it before we just jump in there and
absolutely,
and moderate.
and we decide together. Do we need to intervene, and or maybe in the most recent one, and I'm not going to mention any names, so don't ask.
Nope.
But when somebody somebody recently said something, and then so I said to Ceri, do you know this person personally? Because if you know the person personally, you might be able to send a friendly email or message rather, and just say, "Oh, look, can you might want to remove that yourself." And if not, we might have to step in and just say, cool it down. Let's remember that. And we haven't had to do this a lot, but we are aware that. In fact, one of the things about this group is that it's made me be a lot more careful about my own, the way I act and the things I say, because I used to be one of the first people to jump in and say, "Oh, what a foolish person you are." Maybe not.
Don't I know it? Yes.
maybe using other words. I mean, actually, I just realized that in our questions to you so far, I mean, it does just go to show, like, any kind of big topics like this, big areas where people, there can be a certain amount of guilt on everyone's part about what's going on, and then also, how this ends up playing out online. I noticed that, even our questions first was like, okay, so how is ELT doing in general? I mean, how are we okay? Are we not so bad? It's not so bad for us, is it, or is it? And so on. Maybe a better question, and getting more to what ELT Footprint is about, would be to ask you to share some of the kinds of things that have come up. What kind of projects have been suggested? Because I think that's where it becomes really quite interesting. I mean, because you could see this going in two ways, right? You could see the ELT Footprint saying, we're going to give awards to teachers who are the greenest and to conferences and schools that are green. And then, the flip side is, if you don't, you'll get on our blacklist of like very ungreen schools or whatever, right? Which nobody wants. And that would just lead, but you can totally see that happening. Whereas I think what you've done is kind of avoided that by making suggestions for projects. Do you want to share with us some of those?
Well, what's interesting about this is that nothing, or maybe very little, almost nothing of what we've done has actually been planned beforehand. It's kind of emerged naturally, sort of organically from the group itself. So when we set up the website, blog, it became apparent that a lot of people were interested in finding materials to use with their students. So we decided it would be a good idea to share, have a place like a library, repository, whatever, where we could share these materials. And then we might put a call out. And I think Ceri looked earlier at some statistics, which she'll share with you later, and saw that one of the most popular parts of the sections on the blog is actually the materials side, because I think a lot of teachers who have joined our group, teachers are always looking for interest in materials, and sometimes to leave the coursebook and to find something a bit more interesting. So one thing I like, for example, is that as we've been going through time-wise on the blog, so a date is approaching, and we realize it's going to be World Oceans Day in a week, so we look around and somebody actually shares a nice lesson plan with materials that you can do with your related to that particular day. And this is something that I see as being extremely useful for potentially hundreds of thousands of teachers, where we can say, don't forget to check out this. And so that's one thing I like about the materials.
Can I jump in on there, Kath? I had a question that I wanted to relate to that, because from one materials writer to another, I have, and to another two, to Ceri as well. I've always found it, and I think it's great, and it makes sense that teachers would go to the materials hub, right? The materials recycling bin on the whatever, right? This is what they want, and so on. Any tips or any things that you've seen that so often the quote unquote, and I found this for the past, not just recently, the past 10 or 15 years, the quote unquote green lesson in a course book, to write it, I found very hard. Because it's that kind of fine line between being too earnest and sort of telling people things they already know, or very boring, or not enough new information. I don't know, maybe that's just me as a writer, but I've often found these environmental lessons to sort of be in the danger of eye roll inducing, just from being in classes where, I've seen that come up, and I see the students like, oh, okay, climate change is happening. Oh, all right. And sort of like, what have you come across any things or have any other tips for me or for teachers to make those lessons more interesting? Or do you agree? Or is that
basically Lindsay's looking for writing tips, I think.
No, but I'm looking for teaching tips as well, because the sort of you know it, even in primary classes like the environment or Earth Day or other ones. There's a tendency for them to generate like, oh God, it's like the quote unquote obligatory green lesson.
Yeah, but is that partially because it's not a parsnip topic, but it must be a semi-parsnip topic in the sense that you don't want to offend people with it as well? Is that part of it?
Well, I just say, I'll let Ceri speak about this, but I'll just say one thing that I think that now is the moment, and I think that actually young people especially, okay, because I put a lot of my hope for the future in young people, teenagers and primary children as well. They are talking about these topics now. You can't avoid it really, can you? Everybody knows who Greta Thunberg is. Everybody, there are these, the rebellion people who are going on strike, etc. And I think the fact that our students or the students out there are already talking about things, learning things, got things to say, forming opinions, they have information. That's changed everything a little bit. So I would say that as with everything else, lessons that, they don't have to be boring. And I think the key, as with any topic, is just to find an interesting angle that's motivating. I do understand what you're saying, but I think things have changed. I really do.
I think you could be right.
Yeah,
actually.
I would agree that okay, so lessons I've taught recently that have had an eco twist to them, should I say, have always grown out of local context and of what the students are already doing and already know. So not wanting to preach or teach, because I don't think that's appropriate. It's much more to do with how does this fit into your world or whatever. So for example, this is like I was doing a pronunciation course with some university lecturers, and it was around the first global climate emergency strike, and we looked at slogans, because there were some great creative slogans in the march in London, and then we looked at the Spanish equivalent, and we worked on silly superficial things like consonant clusters and chanting. But that to them was really, really relevant. They loved that lesson because it was something that they thought was incredibly current. And it was because it was happening now in the news and in the town. And I think the thing is that so there was another, Lindsay, you might remember this, was it in May or June? There was a plastic-free week in...
That's right, remember? Yeah. Yes, I remember. Yes.
In the El País newspaper, a columnist, and she ran a story on it every day. It's incredibly entertaining, great style. Yeah. A lot of people were reading it. It was out there on social media as well, and it gave a great context for just exploring. So it wasn't telling anybody anything. It was more about exploring. And so one lesson that I did, and then I also shared it online, was to go into the supermarket and simply take photos of ridiculous plastic wrappings in the supermarket, and then compare that with the non-ridiculous plastic wrappings in the local market, and that's all it was just this very visual kickoff of a project. But then the kids could do exactly the same. All they needed to do was to take their phone into the local supermarket, and then we started talking about which products were hyper wrapped, which ones didn't need to be, what would the alternatives be. And it was very much grounded in their town, their reality, what was going on. And so I think that kind of approach is one thing. Another thing that I think that I've noticed has changed in me in the last however many months, it's only since May, isn't it? So I was working on a writing project at the time, and it was, rather than there being, as you say, the green lesson, as the lesson on technology, which for goodness,
yes,
the lesson on the 21st century. Come on, we're almost in the third decade. And it sprinkles around. And there was one little exchange I had with an editor where there were speaking points at the end of the lesson, and it was, well, have you learned anything new recently? And in the box there are suggestions of different things, and one of the suggestions I just put into the box, so along with a new sport, was ways to use less plastic. And it was just one of the many topics which actually was something that had come up in a class. It was something that people had been interested in talking about, but my editor didn't want it there. Oh, no one wanted to talk about that, was the response.
Dear.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I think
I don't know. Well, but I think maybe you do have a point then, that just in the way that we've ceased to do the technology lesson, and it kind of it goes throughout lessons. So lots of our lessons will have bits of technology, or just becomes part of the thing. Maybe that's one of the things to take from this, is that we don't have the climate lesson, the melting ice caps lesson, that it just becomes part of it, along with questions about other things. So questions using present perfect, or questions using what are you going to do, and stuff like that. It just kind of becomes blended into it. Anyway, I want to keep the interview going. I'm going to pass over to Sean, because we could talk. I mean, this is fascinating. I'd like to talk about this a lot more.
We segued a little bit. That was obviously, they were talking about the projects that ELT Footprint had been suggesting. I think one of those, in a sense, is the charter that you've come up with. Yeah, the charter for a greener classroom, which is downloadable on your website for it. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about that? I mean, number one is the first point: think before you copy. Now, that must be our greatest cardinal sin as ELT teachers, surely, is the photocopy.
Okay, so this is an interesting little project. I think it was our first successful kind of collaborative project, and it happened really early on.
Right.
And it basically was driven by two trainers, although the other people got involved as well. But it was Danny Jones here in Cadiz and Nicola Meldrum in Barcelona. And they both train on CELTA Trinity Certificate and Trinity Diploma. And they were talking actually about their trainees rather than the teachers in the school, as it were. And the first thing that came up was this thing about copying. So that a new teacher, a trainee, that's one of they just kind of sometimes flood their lessons with, paper, and totally unnecessary paper. And this is one of the things that we need to train them into anyway. So that was kind of part of the charter. But there was also this idea of, okay, well, we're forming teachers here. Why not, as it going back to the technology thing, normalizing technology throughout the course. We also normalizing a kind of a consciousness towards your waste footprint particularly, but not only that. So in the charter, there's things like, do you really have to copy that? But it's also, what temperature is the aircon at? Have you switched the lights on, off after the lesson? Sort of all really, really practical things, but also things like being an example. So did you bring a takeaway coffee into class in a styrofoam cup? Maybe you could, if you brought your own a reusable cup, or is your water in a plastic bottle, or do you have your own water bottle that you bring? Especially when we're talking about teachers who are going to be working with younger learners, you are an example.
Yeah.
They're little things that people pick up on. So, I mean, I know I've been banging on about extensive reading for years and years and years, and that where you say, like, if you as a teacher take a book in, it's the same thing as if a parent is seen to be a reader, children are more likely to read. If the teacher shares a love of and an interest in books, well, it's a first step towards the students maybe sharing their interest in books. So if you show that you're being mindful of, let's say, waste in particular, then it's something that the kids can pick up on as well. You're an example of someone who's doing it and not making a big fuss about it, but it's just there. So all of these are kind of bundled into this charter. But the charter was written specifically for the school here in Cadiz. So it exists as a Word document that anybody can adapt. And it also exists as a poster PDF, but there are two versions. There's the 10 points written very simply, 10 bullet points that you can put up on the wall as a poster. You can use it as a talking point, whatever. But also then there's a more discursive one. So for each of the 10 points, there's a little paragraph, things to think about, some suggestions. So Danny, for example, on the diploma course this summer, she actually used it as in the cert course, she used it as an example of a reading race. So kind of a loop input of training the new teachers about the skills of reading, but at the same time, they were reading through the more texty version of the poster. So it's been quite interesting to see the reaction.
Yeah, I can imagine. So I was actually reading through it and just saying that it was kind of the project was between teacher trainers. It is interesting when you look at that. I remember when the argument needs to be about about technology. Why don't teachers use more technology? Often it was it's not in the initial training. Yes, exactly. The trainers don't do it, and it kind of reminds me of that. I mean, in certain ways, the 4-week courses are set up for photocopy. Because of the way they have ad hoc teaching classes, and that's actually when I look at it, when I looked at it for the first time, it was kind of like these a charter for a greener teacher training course as well, not just a greener classroom.
In fact, that was where it first started, was with a discussion on teaching. And Nicola Meldrum from Barcelona, she's written a blog post for the blog about using it with trainees. And so, and then I've seen Danny was using it with our trainees here. And the first week of the course, they taught a week of eco lessons, and the students loved it. They were really engaged. It was on all kinds of different themes. And it carried. They weren't bored with it, and it was really, really interesting to see how they'd so taken it on board that when their initial needs analysis, they'd found out that the students wanted to talk about environmental issues amongst other things, then they'd just gone with that as their all of them did their first lesson on some kind of environmental issue. So it was interesting. It just doesn't take much.
I like it. I think it's actually set there as a piece of material that all teachers can adapt and use as lessons and look at what's already been done for. I think it's a really interesting piece of material with it. We seem to have been chatting for ages. Am I right, Lindsay?
I think so, and I think our time is almost up. So, I mean, over to you, Kath. Do you have any final words or anything before we wrap up?
I mean, on a personal level, I just thought, I would like to invite anybody listening to please come along, find the Facebook page for ELT Footprint, have a look at the blog, join in, ask questions, get involved. On a personal basis, I think Ceri and I would probably both agree. She can tell you now, but I mean, I've changed. I've learned so much since I've been involved in this. I've become more knowledgeable. I've become more aware. I've become less judgmental, which is probably a good thing. I've started saying no more often to certain when offers of trips and talks, or asking for alternatives. I've probably become more boring for certain people by banging on about it all the time. And Ceri and I are talking about travelling to TEFL overland this year together.
Ooh.
And getting the train and
right.
So it's been a bit of a life
walking the walk.
Well, I mean,
walking the walk.
I'd
Walk in the
admire
walk.
that, but bear in mind that at some point that means you'd have to deal with the British rail network.
Oh dear.
We know.
Yeah.
I think that is probably a terrible place to end it, but end it we will have to. Ceri Jones and Kath Bilsborough are both admins on the ELT Footprint Facebook group. You can find out about ELT Footprint at the website, which is eltfootprint.home.blog. That's where you can also, or you can just search for it directly on ELT Footprint on Facebook. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Crikey, time really flew there, didn't it? I looked at the clock and think we've been recording for so long. There's so much we could talk about with them. So many questions.
Oh, definitely. But I'm really happy that they were doing it. It was good to chat to them. It was good to find out. I think, as the news says, this is an evolving story. So a couple of finally things to mention is they also wanted us to mention that it's not just Facebook. They also have a hashtag, a Twitter hashtag for those who don't Facebook. It's hashtag ELT Footprint. And to say the name of their blog again, which is eltfootprint.home.blog, and there you can find out the information about them.
Oh, well, we'll put all the links on our own webpage as well, so people can, if they forget them, go and link them.
To the materials that they talked about, to the charter page, practical lesson plans, and other things that kind of had helped influence them on how they got to where they are right now. And then I guess it's an open invitation to anyone to go along and become a part of it.
I think it is. I think the way we said at the beginning of the episode, what do we call it? A community seems the very apt word. The fact that it's you could contribute to it, you can use the material, take part in the discussion. So, as you said, an evolving story, and I'm sure it's one we'll come back to. I think just listening to that interview, there's so many things that kind of spark in my mind as self-standing episodes we could go on and talk about. So, I think we'll probably come back to it. But for now, I would say it's probably enough to get people going for the first episode of the new season.
I think it is, and we have a whole season in front of us to do more episodes. So if you have any suggestions for us, any comments you'd like to make, you can find us on our webpage, which is, am I going to say it right? www.TEFLCommute.com. Although you don't need the www. You can also find us in all the places on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Spotify, all the places that you get good podcasts. We're there with everyone else. I think that'll bring us to an end of our first episode then.
It will.
Back into the new season.
Lovely to get back into the swing of things. Lovely to speak to you.
That's it from me then. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye for now. See you next episode. Bye.